Hey there, you've just found incredible medicine. Hit like and subscribe to discover stories you won't believe.
He first noticed it in the mirror one dull Tuesday morning, a small bump at the base of his skull, just where the hairline met the back of his neck. A man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck. At first, he dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. He had been shaving when the razor snagged the skin there, and irritation flared. He tapped it with a knuckle, felt the tender give of it, and shrugged it off. There had been a long week at work. Late nights, bad posture, too much coffee. Little aches came and went. This one felt like another passenger on the crowded bus of daily life. By Friday, the bump still sat there. Slightly swollen, slightly warm. He pressed it once, winced, and stepped away from the mirror. He told himself he had probably scratched it in his sleep. The weekend passed with errands, a grocery run, a phone call to his sister about their mother's upcoming checkup. He slept badly. He woke with the pillow damp and thought he had drooled until he realized there was a faint, metallic smell near his collar. When he touched the spot, his fingers came away clean, yet a pulse of pain flickered through the back of his head. As weeks went by, the bump didn't go away. Instead, it became harder, slightly painful, and began to grow. It no longer felt like a soft welt but like a pebble lodged under the surface. He noticed it when he bent forward to tie his shoes, when he tilted his head back to drink water, when he leaned against the car seat and the headrest pressed exactly on that place. His girlfriend, Lena, reached for his neck one evening while they watched a documentary on the couch. Her hand stopped. "You have a knot," she said. "Here." He shrugged. "Just a bite. It's not soft," she said, and the calm in her voice made him feel suddenly absurd, like a child caught hiding a report card. "You should show someone." He made a joke. She didn't laugh. Later, as she folded laundry, he caught her looking at him with a caution he associated with weather forecasts and feral dogs. He told her he would book something. He didn't. The next week turned into another, full of harmless reasons. The bump hardened. A headache developed, then fell away. A flash of fever came one night. In the morning he blamed the heating system. On the third week, the collar of his shirt brushed it, and a current shot down his spine. He stood in the hallway with his coat half on, gripping the railing until the sensation passed. He took the train to work and sat by the window, trying not to press his head against the glass. Every time the carriage jolted, the bump seemed to throb and answer. When he reached the office, he went to the bathroom and lifted his phone camera over his head. The photo showed skin, hair, and something that didn't belong, a raised, rounded hill, faintly reddened along one edge. He remembered climbing a chain-link fence when he was 12, catching a jagged wire that tore a thin line across his scalp. He remembered a soccer game when he was 17, colliding with a goalpost and laughing until the world spun. He remembered a summer job unloading crates, a box slipping, a corner glancing the back of his head hard enough to make his vision dim for an instant. Each memory arrived and receded, a tide of plausible causes. Each failed to settle the unease. Finally, he went to the hospital. The triage nurse asked a dozen questions he had not prepared for: recent travel, animal bites, weight loss, night sweats, numbness, pins and needles, drainage, fevers. He heard himself say no, then hesitated and said, "Some fever." Ben nodded and said, "It got harder." She felt it with gloved fingers and raised her eyebrows. "We'll get imaging," she said. The ultrasound room smelled like warmed plastic. A tech guided the probe with measured patience. On the screen, grays and shadows materialized, a moonlit landscape under skin. "There is a capsule," the tech murmured to herself. "There are calcifications." When she pressed the probe just so, the man flinched, and the technician apologized. "Sorry. Almost done." He sat in an exam room with a paper gown and a patient bracelet. The bump felt bigger under the thin fabric of the gown. The door opened. A surgeon stepped in, gray at the temples, eyes alert but kind. He introduced himself as Dr. Ionescu and asked if the man had ever had surgery near the neck. The man shook his head. Any injuries? Splinters? Old piercings? Nothing I remember, the man said, and then he remembered the chain-link fence again but doubted his own memory as if it belonged to someone else. The surgeon explained what the imaging suggested: a subcutaneous mass, encapsulated, with dense spots that reflected like tiny stones. It might be a benign cyst with calcifications, he said. Sometimes epidermal inclusion cysts harden over time. Sometimes there's a foreign body that the body walls off. Either way, it should come out. Local anesthesia, small incision, we'll send it to pathology. It looked close to the surface. The consent form lay on a clipboard, all sharp lines and legal words. The man signed. The nurse drew a soft rectangle around the bump with a purple pen. In the minor procedure room, the air turned cooler, the ceiling tiles offered squares to count. Lena arrived. He had texted her, finally, and she took his hand until the nurse asked her to wait just outside the curtain. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside was so unexpected that the entire medical team froze in disbelief. The first moment moved quickly, antiseptic painted the skin amber, a sterile drape settled, small talk dried up. The local anesthetic stung, then melted the sharpness into pressure. He felt movement, tugging, the soft scrape of instruments. He stared at the light and listened to the rhythm: clamp, cut, blot, breathe. The surgeon's voice changed, and the man noticed it instinctively, the way one notices a familiar street turning to gravel. It lost its practiced neutrality and dipped into surprise. Instruments paused. A nurse leaned closer. The surgeon said quietly, "That's not keratin." Another voice, maybe the resident, breathed, "What is that?" Pressure increased. The man imagined cotton gauze filling with what he had carried behind his head for weeks, months. He pictured chalky debris, maybe thick sebum-like toothpaste, something ugly but expected. Instead, a metallic tap echoed softly, unmistakable in the closeness of the curtained room. Tap. Tap. The room became smaller. The surgeon asked for fine forceps. "Careful," he said. "Don't scratch it." He lifted something free, and the nurse's breath hitched. "That's metal," the resident whispered. The surgeon laid it on a sterile pad. Another tap, softer, and the man, on the table, felt a wave of cold start at his ribs and rise steadily up his chest, as if the room had tilted and he had begun to slide. They continued with care, widening the incision a fraction, following a channel that ran like the hardened walls of an old river. A fragment of blue thread lay embedded along the path, faded, faint, like a vein of color trapped in stone. The surgeon lifted it, and the thread came away attached to a small knot that looked like a miniature pellet. He placed both beside the first piece of metal. "This looks like an old suture," the nurse said, voice hushed, as if speaking loudly would break something fragile in the air. "But the metal, what about the metal?" When they finished, the surgeon closed the wound with neat, interior stitches, covered it with a dressing, and finally spoke to him in that composed tone again. "You did well," he said. "We removed an encapsulated mass. There were some unusual elements." He glanced toward the tray, then glanced away. "Let's talk outside." They let him sit up slowly. He felt strangely lightheaded, as if something heavy had been lifted from an obscure point in his posture. Lena came in, eyes wide, searching his face. He nodded to reassure her. The surgeon pulled the curtain back and gestured to a corner of the room where a stainless steel tray held a small array under a square of clear plastic, a thin, curved shard of metal no longer than his fingernail, dulled with oxidation, a length of blue suture thread attached to a compact knot, a tiny metallic ring that looked, impossibly, like the broken half of a staple. "This was inside?" the man asked, his own voice pale. He had been the man who had ignored it for so long, dismissed the little hill on his neck as nothing, and now he could not believe what he had been carrying all along. "It was," the surgeon said. "Your body walled it off. Foreign bodies can migrate and lodge. Sometimes trauma introduces particles that remain for years. The thread suggests either an old, forgotten procedure, or perhaps a laceration that was sutured at some point. The metal pieces could be from a staple used externally, or a fragment from an object. We'll send it to pathology and do spectroscopy if needed to identify the alloy. The calcifications formed around it. The man stared at the relics of himself, as if a museum display had been assembled out of his mistakes. Lena touched his arm. Did you ever? She couldn't finish the sentence, but her eyes darted to the scar behind his right ear, the thin, pale line he had never thought about. The fence, he said. When I was a kid. He realized how inadequate that memory felt. The blue thread, the staple, those weren't from playgrounds. They belonged to clinics, to fixes he should have remembered. Had he forgotten a small removal done by a harried urgent care doctor on a summer night? Had he been too young to carry the memory forward? They moved him to recovery and gave him water. The ceiling lights softened. A nurse brought instructions: keep the dressing dry, avoid heavy lifting, watch for swelling and fever. The wound tugged with each swallow, not painful, just present. He heard his name called softly, and the surgeon sat again, this time with a tablet. Pathology will take a look, but the gross appearance suggested a foreign body granuloma, he said. It wasn't cancer. No signs of infection in the capsule. That's good. Relief rose and ebbed, then left uncertainty floating on top. So where did it come from? He asked. Sometimes the story is messy, the surgeon replied. A small staple could have been left during closure after a minor scalp laceration. Or a hairline puncture could have introduced metal. Some fences are galvanized. Over time, tissues move. Gravity, muscle tension, small planes of motion, all can shift debris. The body did what it does, it walled it off and tried to forget. But the calcification and fibrosis made it feel hard and made it grow. He nodded, though the words felt like pebbles skipping across the surface of something deeper. He felt exposed in an odd way, like a room where someone had pulled up a section of floor and found a hidden compartment full of old keys and lint and a small coin no one remembered. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but what they discovered inside stunned them, and now his own life felt like a house with a secret crawl space he had walked over for years without knowing. On the way home, Lena drove slowly. He kept one hand poised just above the dressing, protective but not touching. Street lights passed in measured lines, casting their interrupted glow through the windshield. At a red light, he watched a man on the corner lift a bag of groceries and feel the weight of it, and the simple ordinariness of the gesture filled him with a tenderness he couldn't explain. He had carried something he didn't understand. Now he felt full of the world's quiet, incomprehensible cargo. That night, sleep came in shallow pools. When he woke just before dawn, the room washed gray, he found himself thinking of his father's workbench in the garage, jars of screws, a coffee can full of nails, a magnet wand that clicked and rattled as it collected scattered pins after a project. He remembered his father passing the magnet over the concrete, lifting a constellation of glittering iron bits into order. He remembered being 8, reaching toward the magnet and feeling the tug through the air, the invisible pull that organized the chaos at his feet. He remembered the first time he felt the aura of a thing he could not see, only sense. In the morning, he showered carefully, kept the dressing dry under a makeshift cap of plastic wrap and patience. He dressed in a loose shirt and sat at the kitchen table with coffee growing cool. The cut at the back of his neck hummed, less with pain than with awareness, a minor chord he kept noticing. Lena set a plate down and said, "You're quiet." "There were pieces," he said, and the words sounded silly. Pieces. Like he had been a drawer that someone opened to find random parts. "I don't know where they came from." "We'll find out," she said. "Pathology will tell something. Your medical records might say if you had staples." She touched his fingers. "You're okay." He nodded. He wanted to be okay in a way that stayed put. He wanted answers to travel in a straight line. He pulled out his phone and scrolled back. There were pictures going back years. He looked for images with the back of his head visible. A beach photo where he ducked away from a wave. A work party where someone snapped a candid from behind. a mirror selfie last winter where the towel had draped across his neck. In none of them did the bump appear. In all of them, he found himself studying the space where it would later rise, a blank patch of skin that now read like an erased word. He called his sister at lunch and asked if she remembered him ever getting stitches near his hairline. She paused. "You hit your head on the shed door once," she said. "I remember Mom making you hold a towel to it while she drove you to urgent care. You came back with bandages behind your ear and a lollipop you didn't like because it was grape. How old was I? 10? 11? I can ask Mom. She saved everything. She probably has the discharge papers in a folder labeled head incidents." His sister laughed softly. "Why?" he told her, briefly. He left out the part where the metallic ping had echoed through the procedure room, because even remembering it made his shoulders rise and his jaw set. "Please ask," he said. He returned to work the next day, moving carefully. His coworkers made jokes about hardware upgrades, until his face made them stop. He sat through meetings, the chair back modified by a folded sweater, aware of the wound and the secret it had given up. He found himself noticing small things he would have ignored: a colleague rubbing her wrist as if soothing an old burn, a man at the street vendor tapping his chest twice before paying, a child on the bus carrying a backpack too heavy for his frame but held with stubborn pride. People contained whole storerooms. Most of those doors stayed closed. 2 days later, the pathology report came through the hospital portal, its language meticulous and calm. He met Dr. Ionescu in the clinic to go over it. "Foreign body granulomatous reaction," the surgeon said. "Calcification. No malignancy." Spectroscopy on the metal shard suggested galvanized steel. The suture thread matched old-style polypropylene, still common years ago, non-absorbable. This combination would fit with a scalp laceration closed at an outside facility, the surgeon said. Perhaps a staple used externally, removed, but a fragment remained. Perhaps a suture not migrated. Uncommon, but not impossible. The body did the rest. He thought of the shed door, and the urgent care, and the grape lollipop. He imagined a rushed clinic, a tired practitioner, a boy fussing, a staple remover slipping, a sliver left behind like a splinter the color of the air. He imagined his mother smoothing his hair, saying it looked fine. He imagined time doing what it did best, adding layers until the origin sank beneath the silt. He had dismissed the bump as nothing. He had carried the debris of a day he barely remembered. He walked home through a city that felt newly textured, the edges sharper, the underlayers more present. When he reached his building, he stood at the mailboxes. A neighbor, an older man with a stooped posture, struggled with his key. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," the neighbor said, voice bright with practiced denial. Then he grimaced and said, "Pulled something in my back. Thought it was nothing. It's not nothing." He smiled anyway, an act of stubborn grace. The man nodded in a way that meant more than politeness. "I know the feeling," he said. That evening, his sister texted a photo of a yellowed paper, urgent care visit, scalp laceration, cleaned and closed with staples. The date sat like a small bell. A summer he had spent mowing lawns with a friend, the taste of canned lemonade, songs on the radio. Mom circled staple removal in 7 days and wrote "go back." His sister texted, "Did we go back?" He stared at the screen until the letters blurred. He remembered a baseball game, a promise of ice cream, a week that had spilled its marbles and lost one under the couch. He couldn't remember the removal. Maybe the nurse had taken them out and one had snapped. Maybe a half-millimeter sliver had broken and hidden, small enough to be forgiven, big enough to be found years later by the persistent accounting of the body. He sat with Lena at the kitchen table. They ate in a slow, companionable quiet. Outside, a siren wailed and moved on. He reached up and touched, gently, the edge of the dressing. The pulsing awareness had settled to a distant hum. "It wasn't what I feared," he said. "It was what I forgot." "That's a kind of fear," Lena said. "But now you know." She poured tea. Steam rose and then disappeared. He thought of a man who had noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck, who had dismissed it at first as nothing, an insect bite or a fatty cyst. He thought of how the weeks had gone by, how the bump hadn't gone away, how it had become harder, slightly painful, and begun to grow. He thought of finally going to the hospital, of doctors preparing for a routine removal, of the way the entire room had gone still when they opened the lump and found metal and thread and an old, stubborn memory. He thought of the part of him that had wanted a simple culprit and a clean ending. He cleaned the edges of his life instead, changed the pillowcase, set reminders to drink water, opened a file folder labeled medical and put the discharge paper inside. He called his mother and listened to her apology for a thing no one could fairly own. He told her that he was fine, that it wasn't cancer, that he could already turn his head more easily. He could. It felt like someone had moved a small stone out of the hinge of his body. That night, he took the tray the hospital had given him, a sealed envelope with the photos they had snapped of the removed items, for his records, and slid one picture out. The shard looked ordinary and sinister by turns, a scrap you might sweep from a workshop floor. The knot of blue thread looked almost delicate. He held the photo until his hand warmed the glossy paper and the lamp's reflection dimmed. He slept, and when he dreamed, he walked along a shoreline where the tide had pulled back to reveal the underdrawing of the world, bow caps, sea glass, a key with no lock, a toy soldier missing an arm, a coin too corroded to spend. In the dream, he carried a small magnet wand, and each time he passed it over the sand, glittering iron filings rose to meet it, aligning themselves into tidy designs, a secret order insisting itself out of the chaos. He felt the tug through the air. He woke with a dull ache behind his neck that quickly faded, and he lay there watching the window brighten by degrees. In the days that followed, he returned to the hospital for a wound check. The nurse peeled the dressing away, and the incision lay clean and faintly pink, edges approximated, a new line in a place where no one would ever look unless they knew to look. "Healing well," she said. The resident came by, nodded, asked about pain, about range of motion, about fever. The surgeon stepped in at the end and asked how he felt, genuinely curious. "Lighter," he said. "I keep thinking about what else the body keeps until it can't." The surgeon smiled a weary, knowing smile. "It keeps what it has to," he said. "And then it tells us, one way or another." He walked outside into late afternoon. A breeze lifted the hair at his neck and brushed the tender skin. He did not flinch. Across the street, a boy on a scooter launched from the curb with reckless joy. A woman lifted a toddler and pressed her cheek to the child's hair. A cyclist rolled past with a chain that clicked once, a tiny tick in an otherwise smooth rotation. The city felt like a machine and a garden at once, full of parts and growth, friction and flowering. He went home and stood in the doorway before stepping inside, as if pausing on a threshold he hadn't noticed before. He realized that the story he had told himself, of a harmless bump, of an insect bite, of a fatty cyst, had been an attempt to keep moving without looking down. He realized that stopping had saved him from a quiet, escalating ignorance. He realized that he had entered a different conversation with his own life, one in which he listened to whispers instead of waiting for shouts. And just as he poured water into a glass and set it on the counter, his phone buzzed. The hospital number flashed. He answered and heard the measured tone of the pathology liaison. She confirmed what he already knew about the granuloma and the metal, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, that there was a tiny fragment of something else embedded in the capsule, something they had sent for further analysis. Not tissue, not metal, not suture. "It looked like varnished wood," she said. "A splinter, perhaps. We'll call when the report is complete." He stood very still. The memory of a shed door returned with fresh clarity. The swollen wood after rain, the peeling paint, the way the edge had splintered where the latch had slammed. He could see his 10-year-old self ducking badly, misjudging the clearance, the sudden sting, the bright blood, his mother's hand and the towel, the drive, the grape lollipop. He could see the nurse telling him to hold still and his body doing what bodies did best, flinching. He could see how a fragment could break, how a staple could shear, how a stitch could wander, how a life could seal itself around a lost moment and carry it forward. Lena returned from work and found him at the table with the phone still in his hand. "What happened?" she asked. He told her. She sat across from him and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached for his hand and held it, palm warm against palm. "You're here," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded. Outside, the light thinned. The room settled around them. The cut on his neck tugged once, a reminder, a gentle bell. He breathed and felt, perhaps for the first time since the bump appeared, that his breath traveled the full course of him without obstruction, that it reached the small, stubborn corners and asked nothing in return. He washed the dishes. He dried them and set them in the rack with care that felt like a form of prayer. He turned off the lamp. The dark arrived soft as felt. He went to bed with gratitude resting, weightless, somewhere behind his ribs. He closed his eyes, and the quiet felt earned rather than borrowed. And yet, as he drifted, a detail from the surgeon's face returned to him, a flicker when he had first lifted the metal shard into view, a momentary narrowing of the eyes not of fear but of recognition. He remembered it now with the clarity of hindsight and felt a small, inquisitive thread pull at him from within, the way a loose stitch invites a finger. He had not asked then because he had been relieved, he had not pressed because he had been tired. Now, the question rose and found no purchase to hold on to. The doctors had prepared for a routine removal, but what they discovered had stunned them, the metal and the thread and the possibility of wood, each a breadcrumb in a path that curved backward into his childhood and forward into a story still unfolding. He turned on his side carefully, the incision warm, and listened to the ordinary noises of the building, each a proof of life, each a reminder that even the smallest sounds carried histories inside them, waiting to be heard the moment someone finally paused long enough to listen. The flicker in the surgeon's eyes stayed with him like a note half played. He called the clinic and asked if he could speak briefly with Dr. Ionescu, not to complain or demand, but to understand. The receptionist transferred him, and the surgeon picked up with that same measured steadiness. When the man described the moment, the metallic tap, the blue thread, the way the room had inhaled and held its breath, Dr. Ionescu listened without rushing him. Then he said something the man did not expect. "We had seen a case like yours once. Years ago. Not identical, but close enough to make us pay attention." He went back to the hospital the next afternoon. In a small conference room, the surgeon and a resident named Patel spread out images and notes. The ultrasound with its grayscale moon field, a close-up of the capsule, pearly and thick, the photographs of what had come out, galvanized steel sliver, polypropylene knot, the varnished splinter like a coffee-brown comma. In surgery, bodies told stories without words, Dr. Ionescu said. Sometimes the plot was messy. They asked whether he would allow his case to be presented at the monthly M&M, Morbidity and Mortality, conference. Not to assign blame, the surgeon explained, but to teach. Retained fragments, delayed granulomas, the peculiar paths that foreign bodies took as muscles pulled and fascia shifted, these were the footnotes that kept young doctors awake to possibility. He said yes, surprised by how natural it felt to offer himself up as a cautionary tale and a curiosity at once. He had been a man who noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck and dismissed it as nothing, maybe an insect bite or a fatty cyst. He had waited as weeks went by while the bump grew harder, slightly painful, and larger. He had finally gone to the hospital, where doctors prepared for a routine removal but froze in disbelief at what they discovered inside. He had carried it on his neck all along, now he carried it into a room where others could learn to see it sooner. He sat in the back during the conference in a jacket that didn't rub the healing incision. Slides lit the screen, anonymized, clinical, calm. The resident presented the ARC, presentation, imaging, operative findings. A discussion followed. An older surgeon with hands like carved oak described a time when a teenager fell onto a workbench and walked around for 2 years with a brad nail dormant in his flank. A young emergency physician asked about wound checks and the limits of memory. If a child swore the staples came out, and the chart said they did, who would press harder for proof? A nurse educator raised the point of discharge instructions. how to write them so a rattled parent would not miss the one crucial sentence. The room made a map of his small catastrophe, pins and thread, lessons looped between them. No one mocked. No one shrugged. The tone was sober, lit by the quiet warmth of people who understood that accidents did not make villains so much as they made reminders. Afterward, a pathologist in a neat bow tie approached with a sealed envelope. "You wanted composition details," he said. We ran micro-FTR on the wood fragment. Pine, with an alkyd varnish consistent with exterior treatments from roughly 20 years ago. There were flecks of white paint embedded in the resin. Old, weathered. The words opened a window onto a very specific day, the shed door, swollen after rain, the white paint that his father had brushed on in one long Saturday, the way the latch stuck and then sprung catastrophically. The pathologist smiled lightly, as if handing back a lost button. "Your body kept a piece of your yard," he said. He spent the bus ride home counting the number of invisible things people carried. He watched a woman rub the ring finger of her left hand where a band should have been. He watched a teenager adjust a backpack strap with irritation that had nothing to do with weight. He watched a man in a suit check his watch and then, without seeing it, check again. The city seemed filled with capsules, not only the ones the body built around splinters and metal, but the ones the mind built around days that wouldn't fit anywhere else. At his mother's house that weekend, he climbed the same path along the side yard where the wild mint always spread. The shed door still stood, though the wood had been replaced once since his father died. The hinges creaked in a completely different tone now, higher, cleaner, a difference you only heard if you had the old pitch living in your ear. His mother watched him open and close the door twice and smiled. "Looking for ghosts?" she asked. "Fragments," he said. Inside the shed, the new workbench held the old coffee can of nails and the magnet wand. Still there after all these seasons. He passed it over the bench out of habit, and it clicked loudly as a few screws rose to meet it. The sound went through him with a private resonance. He could almost feel the line between the boy who reached for the magnet and the man who lay under the surgical light, the steel shard lifted into air between gloved fingers. That same invisible pull made visible for a second. He sat with his mother over tea and asked if she remembered the urgent care visit. She did. She remembered his blood in a sock because the dish towel had been in the wash. She remembered the nurse who had freckles and a kind voice. She remembered the way he had flinched when the staple remover clicked. "You were braver than you thought," she said. "And I was more scared than I let on." She showed him a folder labeled Head Incidents in her square handwriting. The discharge papers lay inside, staples to be removed in 7 days, a circle around the instruction, a note to call the clinic. A second paper said staple removal performed. There was a scribbled signature that looked like its writer had been running to another room. The date faded at the edges like a dream trying to leave. He felt no anger. He felt the relief of a story with hinges that lined up. Not justice, not outrage, just alignment. Lena suggested they mark the day in a way that refused to be grand. They took a walk to the flea market in the old rail yard where vendors lined tables with history, tools that still smelled like oil, postcards signed in careful penmanship from the 1950s, enamel bowls with chips like tiny continents. A man sold watch parts sorted into compartments, springs, wheels, gears the size of seeds. He picked up a thin ring gear and felt its delicacy. He set it back as if it might whisper the wrong secret to his skin. He bought nothing. He held Lena's hand. The sky hung a pale blue that reminded him of hospital curtains, but without the taste of antiseptic. At home, he started physical therapy a week later because the resident had noticed how he favored his right side when he described headaches from before the surgery. The therapist, a woman with eyes that laughed even when her mouth did not, watched him move. She found the soft weaknesses that followed small chronologies, years at a desk, a hand that reached back to rub a bump and created a habit of guarding, a neck that had learned to tighten around a threat. She taught him how to let the neck stop being a sentry. He lay on the mat and felt a stretch like someone opening a window an inch at a time. Each inch made room for air he hadn't known he missed. He met with a hospital quality officer who asked if he wanted to file anything formal, about the long-ago staple. He shook his head. "I didn't come to point," he said. "I came to understand." The officer nodded in a way that said he had heard this less often than he would have liked. They talked for 15 minutes about how small errors hid in ordinary days, and how the system asked for perfect memory from people already overwhelmed. The officer walked him out and said, "If you ever feel like speaking to our nursing class, they would learn from the person inside the chart." He said he would think about it. He did. He thought about the freckled nurse more than he would have expected, and about how she had probably gone home that night and worried about a completely different thing. One evening, weeks after the incision had gone quietly flat and pale, he and Lena visited his sister. Their children had found a broken tape measure and were gleefully misusing it as a sword and a lasso until an adult intervened. His sister pulled out a cardboard box labeled Kid Hospital in his mother's handwriting. Inside lay the sediments of their younger catastrophes: an X-ray sleeve with a tiny radius bone drawn in a trapezoid of light, a paper sack with a cast saw tick mark, 2 small staples taped neatly to a page with the caption from another time, "From knee cut, removed." He stared at that page longer than he meant to, the irony almost tender. He remembered the knee cut. He remembered the tickle-terrifying whine of the remover then. He remembered the triumph of seeing the staples on the tape like trophies. The ones behind his ear had not earned their place in the box, but they had earned a different kind of attention in the end. He began to keep a notebook, not because he intended to write a book, but because the act of writing organized his breath. He wrote, "A man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck." At first, he dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. As weeks went by, the bump didn't go away. It became harder, slightly painful, and began to grow. Finally, he went to the hospital. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside was so unexpected that the entire medical team froze in disbelief. The man, who had ignored it for so long, could not believe what he had been carrying on his neck all along. He let the sentence sit there like a spine for all the smaller muscles of memory to attach to. Around it, he made notes of textures: the antiseptic's cool, the drape's whisper, the metallic tap that sounded like a knuckle on a thin door. On a Saturday, he drove past the urgent care clinic where the old record said his staples had gone in and out. The building had new signage, the logo different, the windows tinted darker. He parked anyway and went inside. At the desk, a nurse with a badge that read Evelyn asked how she could help. He explained that he didn't want anything fixed. He wanted to leave a message for the past. Evelyn smiled in a way that reached her eyes. "We get that," she said. "Sometimes people bring cookies for a doctor who isn't here anymore. Sometimes they leave a thank you note for no one in particular." He wrote a note on a plain card: "Thank you for how you probably spoke kindly to a scared boy." A piece stayed. It found its way out years later. "I'm okay." It felt foolish and necessary at the same time. He left it in an envelope labeled "To the busy nurse, any year." Spring pulled forward. He woke with light already pushing at the curtain edges. On a day bright enough to make him squint, he went to a small museum devoted to hands-on physics because a flyer at the hospital had mentioned a demo with magnets and iron filings. He watched a guide pour the dark filings onto a sheet of paper and slide a bar magnet under it. Patterns sprang up as if from nothing, lines that mapped invisible force with a clarity that made children gasp. He stepped closer and felt a sensation he had learned to recognize, a click inside, a recognition between one pattern and another. He thought of his father's magnet wand, of the steel shard waking under the forceps, of the way a life organized itself around points of pull we didn't see until the right light or the right instrument found them. He began to notice a small tingling on the left side of his scalp, no pain, just a change in weather over a very small country. He mentioned it to the therapist, who nodded and traced a finger along the occipital nerve path, explaining how nerves could act like old neighbors, stopping by to remind you they still lived there. It faded over a week, a polite guest who sensed when it was time to leave. In the grocery store line, the woman ahead of him turned and said, "Is that a surgical dressing mark?" He touched the back of his neck, self-conscious, then realized she meant the faint outline of adhesive the shower hadn't fully coaxed away. He said yes. She rolled her sleeve and showed a pink line near her elbow. Mine was glass from a windshield, she said. I didn't even know until a year later. The body is a meticulous accountant. They smiled with the solidarity of people who had learned new respect for surfaces. He visited his father's grave with his mother on a day when the wind dragged clouds like slow ships across the sky. He felt the urge to narrate the whole strange arc aloud. He kept most of it to himself, but he held the magnet wand in his hand like a talisman. You kept the can, he said to his mother. She nodded. He liked the sound, she said. He said it reminded him that a little attention could gather small chaos together. The phrase sat on his tongue for a long time after, a secret he kept taking out to touch. Lena's mother needed help moving a heavy dresser. And when they shifted it, a sliver of mirror glass that had skated under the base years ago flashed and caught on his palm. He removed it with tweezers before it buried itself. The motion felt like a sacrament, a quiet echo of a larger rescue. He taped a small gauze square over the spot and smiled at the thought of all the ways a household became a museum of potential foreign bodies, each waiting for a footstep, each easily avoided if you saw it in time. He returned to the hospital once more, not for a follow-up, but for the nursing class talk the quality officer had mentioned. He stood behind the lectern and held up the photograph of the removed pieces, and he told them not about negligence or fear, but about the long echo of a rushed minute. He told them about the freckled nurse and the grape lollipop, about the shed door and the varnished pine, about the way a man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck and dismissed it as an insect bite or a fatty cyst, while the weeks rolled by and the bump grew harder, slightly painful, and larger. He told them that when the doctors opened the lump, they were stunned, and that the stun lived not only in the operating room, but in his kitchen, his mother's folder, his sister's box, the museum's iron filings, his father's magnet wand. He watched their faces, tired, curious, guarded, kind, shift as the story moved from case to human and back again. When he finished, no one clapped. They nodded, which felt more honest. Walking out, he passed the minor procedure room where it had happened. The curtain stood open. The light had that same square quality, and he could almost hear the metallic tap if he let himself. He did not flinch. He took the stairs slowly, the way you descended from a tall building after seeing far, careful, grateful, aware of your knees. That evening, he and Lena ate outside at a small cafe where the tables wobbled and the owner apologized for the uneven concrete as if he had poured it himself. A kid at the next table dropped a fork, and it made the exact bright ping that had once frozen an entire medical team. He and Lena looked at each other and then, almost at the same time, laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sound had finally returned to the world as itself, just a fork falling, not a shard rising from a wound. He continued to write in the notebook at night. He wrote down the names of people who had placed a hand somewhere in the story: the triage nurse with the steady eyebrows, the ultrasound tech who murmured to herself, the resident who whispered, "What is that?" the pathologist with the bow tie, Evelyn at the desk, the physical therapist who taught his neck to stop guarding, the quality officer, the nursing students with their pens poised, his mother with the labeled folder, his sister with the text, the boy on the scooter, the neighbor with the stubborn mailbox, the woman with the glass scar, Lena with her hand on his. He wrote them as if listing the parts in a careful repair kit. He did not end the list. It wasn't a list meant to be finished. Sometimes, late, he stood at the bathroom mirror and tilted his head just enough to see the faint line the stitches had left. A small, private punctuation. On those nights, he felt a strain of gratitude that was not loud or cinematic, but durable. The body had done its long math. The city went on with its noise and its delicate mechanisms. He set the magnet wand on the dresser where he could see it every morning and every night. He liked the way it held onto tiny screws and then let them go when he asked, a tool that knew both how to gather and how to release. The phone rang once with a number he recognized from the clinic. It was Dr. Patel, the resident, calling on her own time. She had written a draft of a brief case report, and wanted to offer him a copy, not for approval, but because she believed the person whose body carried the story should see the words that would go out into the world. He read it on the couch with the lamp low, and he felt the odd dignity of being rendered in a language that cared about his cells and his capsule and his alloy as much as he cared about his shed and his mother and his fear. He marked one sentence with his finger. The patient presented after several weeks of progressive suboccipital swelling. Intraoperative findings revealed a foreign body granuloma surrounding a galvanized steel fragment, non-absorbable suture knot, and varnished wood splinter consistent with prior trauma. He whispered it aloud. It sounded like a spell that had worked. He texted Patel to thank her. She replied with a single line that made him smile so hard he felt a pull at the back of his neck and didn't mind it at all. Your story helped us see better. And in that quiet room, with the evening sliding across the floorboards like silk, he felt the narrative settle back into the sentence that had started it all, not as a warning now, but as a testament. A man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck and, at first, dismissed it as nothing, an insect bite or a fatty cyst. Weeks went by, the bump hardened, grew, and a small, steady pain asked to be heard. He finally went to the hospital. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside froze them for a heartbeat, and then their hands moved with a different kind of care. The man who had ignored it for so long listened, at last, to what he had been carrying on his neck all along, and to everything else he had been carrying, the visible and the hidden, the metal and the memory, the thread and the tenderness, none of it finished, all of it alive. He woke the next morning with a steadier quiet in his chest and wrote again at the top of a fresh page, as if braiding the spine of his days to the spine of the tale. A man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck. At first, he dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. As weeks went by, the bump didn't go away. It became harder, slightly painful, and began to grow. Finally, he went to the hospital. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside was so unexpected that the entire medical team froze in disbelief. The man, who had ignored it for so long, could not believe what he had been carrying on his neck all along. He let the sentence rest there, and then he added what he hadn't yet said. The world had widened around that revelation, not narrowed. He began to notice an urge to make order that didn't come from fear anymore. In the kitchen drawer where rubber bands and batteries tangled, he used 2 bowls and 10 patient minutes until each item had a home. He went through his email and created folders labeled with verbs instead of nouns: answer, read, hold, decline. He found that verbs moved him, while nouns dared him to freeze. He gave himself permission to archive messages that had lived too long in his inbox, the way the body had finally archived the shard. The small relief he felt after each deletion surprised him with its clarity. On a wet afternoon, he met a friend from school he hadn't seen in years, a photographer named Mitra who shot long-form projects about ordinary hands at work: cooks, cobblers, mechanics. Over coffee, he told her the outline. She listened as if his words were part of an assignment she had wanted for a long time. I had a series once, she said, called Retained. People stood with X-rays where the foreign things still lived inside them. A paperclip, a needle, a bullet. Not gore, just persistence. She laughed, but gently. Your shard left, but the story stayed. That counts. They walked to her studio, a second-floor room that smelled faintly of developer and old wood. On one wall, she had pinned a grid of small prints: the palm of a carpenter with a splinter's crescent scar, a dancer's ankle with a seam of pale tissue where an arthroscopy port had been, a seamstress's finger with a pinprick tattoo of blue. He felt a kinship that wasn't about injury but about testimony. He stood before Mitra's lens not as a specimen but as a witness. She asked him to hold the hospital photo of the shard and thread, and she asked him to look slightly away from the camera, as if listening to a sound he almost recognized. The click of the shutter landed in him with a friendly echo. A week later, an envelope with heavy paper arrived in his mailbox. Inside lay the photograph and a note from Mitra: for your notebook. He slid the print between pages near the first sentence about a man who noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck and dismissed it as nothing. The image made the words feel anchored, the way a compass needed a weight to swing true. One evening, the quality officer from the hospital emailed. The nursing students had asked for a second talk, this time with a Q&A. He went again. They asked hydrated questions, what the first sensation had been, why he had waited, which phrases from clinicians had soothed and which had scalded. He told them the truth, that "It's probably nothing" sounded merciful but sometimes encouraged delay, that "Let's look now" had landed like a chair pulled out for him at a crowded table. He told them that when doctors prepared for a routine removal but opened the lump and froze in disbelief, their silence had mattered because it turned into carefulness instead of panic. He told them he had felt held in that pause, as if the room had agreed to breathe for him while he couldn't. On a Sunday, he drove his mother to a small church rummage sale where the tables bowed under the odd gravities of other people's attics. Near a stack of vinyl records, he found an old carpenter's box with partitions and a sliding lid. He bought it for $2 and a smile that remembered his father's hands. At home, he set it on the dresser and began a private museum, the hospital photo in a sleeve, the note he'd left at the urgent care copy for himself, the magnet wand, a pine shaving he had planed from the new shed door and sealed with clear varnish, a small strip of blue thread cut from a sewing kit, not the same but near enough to speak to it. He added a slip of paper with the line that wouldn't leave him. A little attention gathered small chaos together. His sister texted him the freckled nurse's first name. She had found it in a stack of cards their mother had kept with "Thank you," scrawled in childish hand. He didn't try to find her last name or send a letter that might land in the wrong life. He wrote her a letter all the same and put it in the carpenter's box. In it, he wrote what he couldn't put anywhere else, that a day might have frayed under her hands, that a fragment might have stayed, but that his memory of her kindness had stayed longer, and that he suspected she had saved far more than she had ever lost. The letter wasn't meant to travel through the mail. It had already arrived where it needed to, somewhere in him that answered to gratitude. Work shifted in small, true ways. He asked for a better chair and got one. He stood every hour and reset his shoulders. He learned the ergonomics of his breath. When a teammate mentioned a stiff lump on her forearm, probably nothing, he told her his story plainly and added, "It cost me one appointment to sleep better." She went. It was nothing, which turned out to be something after all. He and Lena took a weekend day trip to the coast. The wind bullied their hair, and gulls argued about its ship. He walked the titterline and knelt when something caught the light just right, a bottle green sliver of sea glass worn down to softness. He held it to the sun and saw the world distort around a curve without edges. He put it in his pocket. It sat there with the weight of a word he trusted. Back in the city, he got a message from Dr. Patel. The brief case report had been accepted by a modest surgical journal. A second, shorter piece would appear in a newsletter for emergency practitioners under the headline, "Not Just a Lump." She asked if he wanted to attend a small hospital seminar where cases like his were used to tune the questions triage nurses asked. He went. He watched them practice phrasing. "When did you first notice? Has it changed? Any injuries there in the past?" He noticed how a question could open a door gently or bang it. He noticed how people leaned forward when a colleague said, "What else might it be?" The air in the room felt clean, like it had been newly filtered through attention. He had one more appointment with physical therapy. The therapist tested his range of motion, nodded, and said, "You've stopped guarding." She showed him a simple sequence he could do in 2 minutes every morning, a bow to the next ecology. He did it each day, just after setting the magnet wand upright in its little wooden box. It took less than the time an egg took to boil and did more for him than most thoughts he had in that span. On a warm night when windows stayed open, he and Lena ate late and spoke about nothing urgent. The city sent up its ordinary chorus: footsteps, a bus sighing, laughter 3 floors down. He felt that now familiar tug to write, and he returned to the notebook. He wrote the sentence again, the one about a man who noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck and dismissed it as an insect bite or a fatty cyst, and the weeks going by, and the bump hardening and growing, and the hospital where the routine unraveled into astonishment. Then he wrote about all the adjacent lives that had folded themselves gently around his, the pathologist with the bow tie who had handed him pine and paint in words, Evelyn at the desk who had known how to steward a message to the past, Mitra, who had given him back a face he recognized from the inside, his mother, with her folder labeled Head Incidents, his sister, with her text that turned a summer into a sentence, the students who had listened without clapping, and Lena, who had placed a hand on his back exactly where he used to flinch and found, there, only skin. One afternoon he noticed a small, smooth bead under the skin of his forearm, the kind of thing you only found when idly scratching an itch. He did not spiral. He pressed gently, noted that it moved easily, that it didn't hurt, that it felt like a little pearl. He made an appointment without drama, went, and heard the pleasant, slightly bored certainty of a clinician who said, "Lipoma." He drove home unfrazzled. A part of him had learned the difference between vigilance and fear. Another part had learned that even when fear came, he could translate it back into verbs. The old neighbor with the stubborn mailbox called out to him one morning. "It's the back," he said with a grin like a wince. "Physical therapist taught me to breathe into it. Who knew backs listened to lungs?" They stood together for a few minutes like men on a ship deck, talking about pain with the wryness of sailors who had decided to learn the names of the winds. Mitra opened a small group show. He stood in a room full of photographs of wrists, ankles, shoulders, and scars that looked like punctuation marks in a language that ran beneath English. His portrait hung near a window. He watched strangers step closer to read the small card beside it, which said nothing about him and everything about the human trick of keeping going. He felt shy and also pried open by a warm hand. After the show, they all walked to a cheap noodle shop and laughed louder than seemed sensible for people who had spent an evening looking at wounds. It felt correct. The opposite of grief wasn't joy, exactly, it was company. He visited the shed one more time in a rain that had the smell of metal. The drops struck the new door with a sound that pleased him. It had no echo of injury in it. He ran a hand along the varnished frame and found a line where the brush had lifted, a ridge as thin as a thread. He thought of the alkyd resin the pathologist had named, and he imagined the chemistry of his childhood captured in a sentence that fit on a slide. He stood there until the rain softened. He went back inside and dried his hair like a man who had learned where his head ended and the sky began. When the case report appeared online, Dr. Patel sent him the link. He read it twice. At the bottom, the acknowledgments included a single, precise line. "We thank the patient for reminding us that what looks routine may hold a story." He closed his eyes and felt the line settle into him like light into water. On a bus ride home, a teenager across the aisle wore a shirt that read "Listen Harder." It felt on the nose and exactly right. He smiled to himself and looked out the window at a city full of sealed capsules, the old brick painted new, the tree roots lifting sidewalk slabs like slow breath, the patched asphalt where a utility crew had dug and mended. He felt a gratitude that didn't ask to end. He kept the gratitude like he kept the magnet wand, where he could see it, where he could pick it up with one hand, where it felt like a tool, not a shrine. That night, he wrote one more page. He did not try to wrap anything. He wrote about the fork ping at the cafe, now just a fork. He wrote about the lipoma that turned out to be a lipoma, and how relief felt properly sized. He wrote about the sentence he kept at the top, not because he feared forgetting, but because he liked the way it tuned him. A man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck. At first, he dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. But as weeks went by, the bump didn't go away. Instead, it became harder, slightly painful, and began to grow. Finally, he went to the hospital. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside was so unexpected that the entire medical team froze in disbelief. The man, who had ignored it for so long, could not believe what he had been carrying on his neck all along. He underlined the last clause once, lightly, the way you might smooth a sheet before you lay down, not to iron out every crease, but to make a place that held your shape. He put down the pen and, before turning out the light, lifted the magnet wand from its slot and passed it over the carpenter's box in a small, private ceremony that no one had taught him and no one would need to inherit. The iron screws leapt toward the wand with their soft, clicking eagerness. He felt the old tug in the air, the one from his father's garage and the physics museum and the operating room. He let the screws hang there for a breath, aligned, held, seen. Then he tilted the wand, and they slipped back into their compartments with the clean sound of things returning to where they belong. He moved through the next weeks with a kind of quiet precision, like someone who had finally learned the true weight of his own pockets. He watered the plant that always leaned toward the window and rotated the pot so it would not grow lopsided. He returned a library book on time for the first time in months. He made a dentist appointment he had postponed. None of it felt like a crusade. It felt like putting small screws back where they belong. One afternoon, he received a message from the community clinic near his work. A free screening fair in the park, blood pressure checks, glucose tests, a tent where a family doctor answered questions. He walked past on his way home and recognized Dr. Patel volunteering in a simple blue t-shirt, hair tied back, a clipboard under one arm. She greeted him with the ease of someone happy to run into a chapter from a book she liked. "Stay," she said. "Tell your 2-minute version." He did. He stood near the edge of the tent and told 3 people, then 6, then 12, that he had noticed a small bump, that he had dismissed it as nothing, that weeks had passed, that pain had sharpened the edges, that the hospital had prepared for a routine removal and found a small, impossible museum under his skin. He watched faces relax not with entertainment, but with relief, as if the act of hearing a thing named robbed it of some of its shadow. An older man approached at the end, hand to his neck in a way that looked instantly familiar. "Been there," the man said, and he lifted his collar just enough to show a faint line that mirrored his own. "Mine was glass from a crash in '87. Woke up with it gone and a cough that tasted like metal. Body remembered for me until I listened." They shook hands. It felt like a password exchanged among careful people. He and Lena traveled to his mother's for a Sunday lunch where the table held too much food in exactly the right way. After the dishes were cleared, his mother brought out a small cardboard box he hadn't seen before. "Your father saved this," she said. Inside lay the old staple remover, the one he remembered as a creature with silver teeth. Age had dulled it to a pewter calm. "He kept it after the clinic gave us a new one for the first aid kit," she said. "He said it reminded him that most fixes started with taking something out." The remover rested in his palm like a memory that had learned manners. He added it to the carpenter's box when he returned home, set between the magnet wand and the varnished shaving of pine. Mitra's show closed, and she gifted him the framed print of his portrait. He hung it not in the living room but in the hallway where he passed by without ceremony 10 times a day. He liked how it lived at the edge of attention, ready to be seen but never needing to be announced. The nursing school invited him one last time, this time to a larger auditorium. He planned for 10 minutes and spoke for 12. He did not dramatize the metallic ping or the hush in the room. He described them plainly. He spoke about the sentence that had become the spine of his days, about how a man noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck. At first, he dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. As weeks went by, the bump didn't go away. It became harder, slightly painful, and began to grow. Finally, he went to the hospital. Doctors prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they opened the lump, they were stunned. What they discovered inside was so unexpected that the entire medical team froze in disbelief. The man, who had ignored it for so long, could not believe what he had been carrying on his neck all along. He let the words settle and then added the part that most seemed to shift the room, that the care after the surprise felt as important as the surprise, that small sentences from steady people had restored his weight to him inch by inch. At the end, a student with a tired face waited until the others drifted out. "My mother kept everything," she said, and then she laughed at herself for the sudden confession. "I thought it was clutter. I think I understood today what she kept it for." He nodded. He had learned that some archives existed not for retrieval but for mercy. A month after the fair, Evelyn at the urgent care desk called. A woman came in with a note for the busy nurse, any year, she said, voice bright with the pleasure of closing a circle. She said she used to work here. She didn't leave a return address. She left a line for you if I could find you. He felt his chest shift, a drawer opening. The line said, I don't remember your face, but I remember that day. Thank you for carrying it well. He stood at the kitchen counter and let the words hang between the cabinets, and the light like a string you could gently pluck to hear its tone. Thank you, Evelyn, he said, for delivering the mail. He scheduled one final follow-up with Dr. Ionescu, not because the incision misbehaved but because an ending required witness. In the familiar exam room, the surgeon examined the pale line, pressed gently along the muscles that had once clenched like a fist, and leaned back with the expression of a person who had watched a storm pass and counted the shingles afterward. Healed, he said. No recurrence. You look good. They shook hands, and in the doorframe the surgeon paused. You helped us teach, he said. That matters. The words landed with the clean sound of a bolt snug just right. On his way out, he detoured through the corridor to the minor procedure rooms. A fresh curtain hung there now, the fabric unstained and slightly stiff with newness. He stood for a moment and heard nothing unusual: the soft wheel of a cart, the murmur of two voices down the hall, the faint tick of an air vent. The silence carried no echo of fear anymore. It carried the plain dignity of rooms in which people did ordinary work, some of it hard, most of it careful. At home that evening, he opened the carpenter's box and took stock: the photograph from the hospital, the pine shaving with its varnish catching the light like honey, the note he had left for the busy nurse, the magnet wand, the old staple remover with its softened teeth, the slip of blue thread from the sewing kit, and a small card on which he had written the sentence that had followed him from mirror to operating room to lecture hall to kitchen. He traced the edges of each object with the tip of one finger, the way you might remind yourself of a shoreline you could now draw by heart. He cooked with Lena in a quiet that felt companionable rather than empty. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the sink, an orchestra of small noises: water against steel, the click of a plate against a rack, a drawer closing with the satisfaction of a truth told. On the counter, a bowl held the sea glass from the coast, the pieces soft as thought. He added a new one, a found shard from the sidewalk that had worn itself kind through weather and time. Later, he wrote in the notebook without the need to convince or defend. He wrote about Mitra's print and Evelyn's call and the student's mother and the older man at the fair who had said, "Been there," like a blessing. He wrote about the way he had stopped guarding his neck, how the muscles had agreed to stand down, how the breath had found its old rooms and made itself at home. He wrote about gratitude as a habit rather than an event. When the page filled, he closed the notebook and set the pen on top, aligned with the spine. He picked up the magnet wand one last time that night and passed it slow over the screws in the carpenter's box. They rose in their light armor and clung with that soft, clicking eagerness he had known since boyhood. He held them there, aligned and attentive, and felt again the exact pull that had threaded through his life, the tug of memory, the draw of care, the attraction between what we carry and what finally lifts it free. Then he tilted the wand, and the screws fell back into their partitions with the small, orderly sounds of things returning to their places. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, the room revealed its ordinary grammar: the hum of the refrigerator, the thin rush of the radiator, a car door outside, a neighbor's laugh. He laid down and felt the mattress accept his shape without argument. He did not rehearse the old moments anymore. He did not banish them either. He let them take their seats in the quiet. A man had noticed a small bump forming on the back of his neck. At first, he had dismissed it as nothing, maybe just an insect bite or a fatty cyst. As weeks had gone by, the bump hadn't gone away. It had become harder, slightly painful, and had begun to grow. Finally, he had gone to the hospital. Doctors had prepared for a routine removal, but as soon as they had opened the lump, they had been stunned. What they had discovered inside had been so unexpected that the entire medical team had frozen in disbelief. The man, who had ignored it for so long, had not believed what he had been carrying on his neck all along. And then he had learned to listen, first to the body's quiet accounting, and then to the softer registers of a life that had always been speaking to him in careful, ordinary tones. He slept, and the world around him kept its steady, merciful hum.